The bell rang through the corridors of Westfield High, marking the beginning of another day. Students filed into their classrooms, their chatter filling the hallways. In room 207, the air was unusually tense. Miss Holloway stood at the front of the class, her sharp gaze tracking each student as they entered. Known for her strict teaching style, she was both respected and feared by her students. The last student entered the room, Jasmine King, the new transfer. Her presence drew immediate attention, her confidence understated yet undeniable. As she found an empty desk, Miss Holloway's expression shifted, a flicker of displeasure quickly masked by a tight-lipped smile. "Well, Miss King," she began, her tone measured but unmistakably critical, "I trust you're prepared for the high expectations we maintain in this class." Jasmine offered a polite nod, her voice steady. "Yes, ma'am." Miss Holloway turned to the whiteboard, writing in bold, "Themes of power and injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird." The classroom grew quieter as students focused on the topic, but the atmosphere felt charged, the weight of unspoken tensions pressing down. The discussion began, and Jasmine raised her hand, eager to contribute. Miss Holloway's eyes swept the room, deliberately skipping over Jasmine. Instead, she called on Sarah in the front row, whose hesitant answer lacked depth. Jasmine lowered her hand, her calm demeanor barely concealing her frustration. As the lesson progressed, the subtle exclusion became more apparent. Each time Jasmine raised her hand, Miss Holloway avoided acknowledging her, opting instead for less prepared students. When Jasmine finally spoke, her answer was interrupted and dismissed. "Let's not impose modern interpretations onto a classic work," Miss Holloway said, her tone cutting. The room fell silent. Jasmine's grip tightened around her pen, but she kept her composure. Over the following weeks, this pattern persisted. Miss Holloway's disdain was subtle but consistent. Jasmine's essays were marked more harshly than her peers, her ideas dismissed as irrelevant or incorrect. Despite this, Jasmine continued to work diligently, her quiet strength becoming evident to a few of her classmates. Outside the classroom, Jasmine confided in her father, Mr. King, the school principal. He listened attentively, offering measured advice. His calm authority and encouragement gave Jasmine the strength to persevere. The situation escalated during a group project. Miss Holloway deliberately assigned Jasmine to work with students who were known for their lack of effort. Jasmine took on the bulk of the work, determined to ensure the presentation was of high quality. When the day of the presentation arrived, Jasmine stood before the class, her preparation evident in the polished visuals and well-researched points. Yet Miss Holloway interrupted her repeatedly, questioning her choices and undercutting her arguments. By the end of the presentation, Jasmine returned to her seat, her face burning with frustration. But something had shifted. Sarah, one of her classmates, slid a note onto her desk. It read, "What's happening isn't fair. Let me know if you need help." Jasmine felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps she wasn't entirely alone. The following week, during another presentation, the classroom door opened. Mr. King entered quietly, taking a seat in the back. His presence drew curious glances from the students, though Miss Holloway remained oblivious. Jasmine, noticing her father, felt a mix of surprise and relief. As the lesson continued, Miss Holloway's dismissive behavior persisted. Mr. King observed silently, his expression unreadable, as the tension in the room grew heavier. The chapter concludes as Jasmine's gaze meets her father's, and the unspoken understanding between them signals that change is imminent. The morning sun cast long shadows across Westfield High as Jasmine stepped into room 207. The hum of students settling in was familiar, but today felt different. Jasmine's steps were measured, her resolve firm. She knew she couldn't let Miss Holloway's prejudice silence her voice. Miss Holloway stood at the front of the room, her presence dominating. Her gaze swept over the students before landing on Jasmine. It lingered just long enough to send a clear message. "Challenge me, and you'll regret it." The lesson began with a discussion on To Kill a Mockingbird. Miss Holloway's tone was as sharp as the chalk scratching across the board. As she addressed the symbolism of the mockingbird, her questions were deliberate, her gaze bypassing Jasmine. Finally, she paused, turning to face the class. "Miss King," she said, her voice cool, "since you've been so eager to contribute lately, What do you think the mockingbird represents? Jasmine's heart pounded, but she met Miss Holloway's gaze with quiet strength. The mockingbird, she began, represents innocence destroyed by prejudice. It's a symbol of how systemic injustices harm those who are vulnerable. The room went silent, the weight of Jasmine's words hanging heavy. Miss Holloway's lips curled into a thin smile, her tone laced with condescension. Interesting. Though I'd suggest you avoid overanalyzing the text. It's a classic, not a political statement. A ripple of discomfort passed through the class. Jasmine clenched her pen tightly, forcing herself to remain composed. Inside, she felt the sting of humiliation, but her resolve only hardened. As the lesson progressed, Miss Holloway's behavior grew more pointed. When Jasmine raised her hand again, the teacher ignored her, calling on a student who barely whispered a response. Jasmine's presence seemed to provoke her, and the tension in the room became suffocating. Later, during a group project discussion, Sarah, a quiet girl who usually avoided conflict, finally broke the silence. I think Jasmine's interpretation is valid, she said, her voice hesitant but steady. She's using evidence to back up her points. Miss Holloway froze, her gaze icy as it snapped to Sarah. Thank you for your insight, she said curtly. However, as the teacher, I'll decide what is and isn't valid in this classroom. Sarah's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. Jasmine caught her eye, offering a small nod of gratitude. It was the first time anyone had stood up for her in weeks. After class, Miss Holloway called Jasmine to her desk. Her tone was clipped, her words dripping with authority. Your attitude is becoming disruptive, Miss King. If you can't adapt to the standards of this class, perhaps you should reconsider your place here. Jasmine held her ground, her voice calm but firm. Respectfully, Miss Holloway, I'm here to learn, just like everyone else, and I intend to. Miss Holloway's expression darkened, but she didn't respond. Jasmine turned and walked out, her head held high, though her heart ached with the weight of constant judgment. That evening in his office, Mr. King reviewed reports from students and staff. Each account painted a damning picture of Miss Holloway's behavior. The pieces were falling into place, and he knew that soon the facade of fairness she wore would crack. The following day, Jasmine entered the classroom with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew she couldn't let Miss Holloway's prejudice define her. This was her education, her fight, and she wasn't backing down. In the quiet of the hallway, as students filed in, Sarah approached Jasmine, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner, she said, but I'm with you now. Jasmine smiled softly. That means more than you know. The chapter ends as the bell rings, the classroom brimming with unspoken tension. Jasmine prepares herself for the battle ahead, unaware that justice is already in motion, waiting for the right moment to strike. The classroom had always been a place of learning, growth, and discovery, or so Jasmine had believed. At Westfield High, it was becoming a battlefield. The air felt heavier each day, weighed down by the tension that swirled around her. Miss Holloway's sharp words had carved invisible barriers, but what hurt more was the growing divide among her peers. By now, Miss Holloway's disdain for Jasmine wasn't just a subtle undercurrent, it was a storm brewing in plain sight. During group activities, Jasmine was paired with students who either dismissed her contributions or outright refused to engage with her. Quiet murmurs passed between them, whispers sharp enough to cut. Why does she have to make everything about race? A boy muttered under his breath, loud enough for the surrounding students to hear. Jasmine's pen paused mid-sentence, her knuckles tightening around it. She didn't look up, her face a mask of calm. Inside, though, a familiar ache took root. Miss Holloway's behavior emboldened the others. During class discussions, students who once hesitated now smirked when Jasmine spoke. A girl in the back of the room laughed openly one day when Jasmine stumbled over a response. Miss Holloway's eyes flicked toward the sound but didn't reprimand the student. Instead, she adjusted her glasses and continued as if nothing had happened. It wasn't just the direct comments that stung. It was the isolation. Jasmine's desk began to feel like an island. Fewer classmates sat near her, and those who did often leaned away as if her presence was contagious. One afternoon, the tension peaked. Miss Holloway handed back graded essays with her usual flourish of superiority. Jasmine's paper came last, A red C minus scrawled across the top in bold strokes. Beneath the grade was a single line: focus less on personal interpretations and more on academic analysis. Guess she's not as smart as she thinks, someone whispered. Maybe Miss Holloway's finally putting her in her place, another voice added. Jasmine pressed her lips together, willing herself not to react. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The day's lesson carried on, but Jasmine barely heard it. Her thoughts churned, replaying every slight and snide comment, each one stacked like bricks, building a wall around her. In the weeks that followed, the harassment took on new forms. Notes scrawled with cruel messages appeared on her desk. A paper airplane sailed across the room one morning, landing with precision at her feet. Unfolding it, Jasmine read the single word: why? Why did she speak up? Why didn't she just stay silent? Her only solace came in fleeting moments. Sarah had become bolder, offering small smiles of encouragement or whispering words of support. But Sarah's efforts were often drowned out by the tide of hostility. Miss Holloway's actions, or lack of them, were like gasoline on a fire. When Jasmine raised her hand, the teacher's gaze swept past her as if she were invisible. When other students mimicked her answers with mocking tones, Miss Holloway's lips curled into a faint smirk. One day, as Jasmine left class, she overheard Miss Holloway speaking to another teacher in the hallway. She just doesn't have the same foundation as the others, Miss Holloway said, her voice carrying. It's not surprising, really. Some students just don't belong in advanced settings. The words clung to Jasmine like thorns. That night, as she sat at her desk, she thought of her parents, of the sacrifices they'd made to ensure she had opportunities they hadn't. Her father's late nights at the school, her mother's gentle reminders to hold her head high. She couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. By the end of the week, Jasmine made a decision. If no one in that room would stand up for her, she'd have to stand up for herself. She began documenting everything: the comments, the grades, the unspoken hostility. Each instance was a stone, and together they would build her defense. The cracks in Miss Holloway's authority were beginning to show, though. A few students, emboldened by Jasmine's quiet strength, started questioning the teacher's decisions. Sarah wasn't alone anymore. Others began whispering their support, subtle nods of solidarity that carried more weight than words. Jasmine didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she wouldn't let prejudice win. The classroom had become a war zone, but Jasmine was done retreating. She was ready to fight, not with anger, but with the power of resilience and truth. And this time, she wasn't alone. The classroom bore the same air of tension it always did when Jasmine walked in. But today it was different. Today the stakes were higher. Project presentation day loomed large, and Jasmine knew all eyes would be on her, not just from her classmates, but from Miss Holloway, who seemed intent on undermining her at every turn. The students filtered in, their voices hushed, as if they too could sense the charged atmosphere. Jasmine settled at her desk, her notes neatly arranged in front of her. The project she had poured hours into lay on the desk, a silent testament to her determination. Miss Holloway stood at the front, her gaze cold and appraising. "Let's get started," she said, her tone clipped. The first few presentations passed without incident, but the air shifted when Jasmine's name was called. The walk to the front of the room felt longer than it should have, as if the weight of expectation pressed down on her shoulders. Jasmine's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the project board behind her, but her voice was steady when she began to speak. Her presentation unfolded with a quiet power, each word measured and purposeful. Jasmine's analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird delved deep into its themes of racial injustice and the quiet acts of defiance that ripple through oppressed communities. Her voice wove a narrative that demanded attention, even from those who had dismissed her before. But Miss Holloway was waiting. "An interesting perspective," she said, her words a thinly veiled challenge. "But isn't it reductive to focus solely on race? Surely the novel offers broader themes than that." The comment landed like a slap in the room, its condescension reverberating off the walls. Jasmine paused, meeting Miss Holloway's gaze head-on. Her words, though steady, carried a quiet defiance. "Ignoring race would erase the novel's very core. This story isn't just literature. It's truth. Miss Holloway's lips thinned into a line. The room felt as if it were holding its breath. Then with a dismissive wave of her hand, the teacher said, "Your analysis lacks depth and academic rigor. Perhaps next time, you'll approach the text with a more critical eye." The humiliation hung heavy in the air, visible on Jasmine's face, yet she didn't falter. She simply stepped back from the board, her movements measured, and returned to her seat amidst the deafening silence. After the bell rang, Miss Holloway called Jasmine to her desk. The other students filed out, their whispered speculations filling the hallway. Jasmine approached with measured steps, her chin held high despite the storm brewing inside her. "You've been disruptive," Miss Holloway said sharply, her voice low but no less cutting, "and your peers clearly struggle to work with you. Perhaps you should reflect on that before your next group project." Jasmine's reply never came, for at that moment, the door swung open. Standing in the doorway was Mr. King, his commanding presence silencing the remaining whispers in the room. "I thought I'd observed today's class," he said, his tone neutral, but with an edge that hinted at something more. Miss Holloway's face stiffened. "Of course," she said, her voice tight as she motioned to a seat in the back. "We were just finishing up." As the next lesson unfolded, Miss Holloway's demeanor grew more pointed. She dismissed Jasmine's raised hand, interrupted her answers, and nitpicked her every move. Even the simplest acts, like the way Jasmine adjusted her pen, seemed to draw the teacher's scrutiny. But Mr. King noticed everything. His sharp gaze flicked between teacher and student, taking in every slight, every microaggression. He sat in silence, but his posture radiated authority, a silent promise that this behavior would not go unchecked. Jasmine, for her part, held her ground. She met every dismissive comment with quiet resilience, her silence speaking louder than any words could. When the bell rang again, Mr. King stood, his voice cutting through the noise of departing students. "Miss Holloway, I'd like a word in private." The words carried an authority that left no room for argument. Miss Holloway hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding stiffly. The students exchanged glances as they filed out, their curiosity palpable. Jasmine lingered at the door, catching Mr. King's subtle nod of reassurance before she stepped into the hallway. Behind the closed door, a conversation began that would ripple far beyond the walls of that classroom. Chapter 5. The Unraveling. The air in the school had grown heavy with unspoken tension, like a storm waiting to break. After Jasmine's public humiliation during her presentation, whispers began to spread through the hallways. Her classmates were talking, not just about the presentation, but about Miss Holloway. For years, her behavior had gone unchecked, dismissed as strictness or high expectations. Now, with Jasmine standing at the center of it all, the veil was beginning to lift. Jasmine walked into class the next day, her resolve unwavering despite the simmering discomfort around her. Her classmates glanced at her and then quickly looked away, some in guilt, others in fear of drawing Miss Holloway's ire. The teacher herself was already at her desk, her expression colder than ever. As Jasmine settled into her seat, she felt the weight of Miss Holloway's gaze. It was sharp, scrutinizing, as though the teacher were daring her to make another move. The lesson began, but the words felt hollow. Miss Holloway's usual energy was replaced by a curt efficiency, her authority diminished by the cracks that had begun to form in her facade. That afternoon, the principal made an announcement. The school would be hosting a town hall meeting to address growing concerns from students and parents. Jasmine knew what it was about. Her story had reached the administration, and now it was out of her hands. As the day progressed, Jasmine felt the tension in her chest grow. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or anxious. Part of her wanted to believe that this was the turning point, that the system would finally hold Miss Holloway accountable. But another part of her, the part that had faced years of microaggressions and systemic dismissal, warned her not to hope too much. When the town hall began, the auditorium was packed. Parents, teachers, and students filled the seats, their faces a mixture of curiosity. The room remained silent, the tension palpable. It was clear that her words weren't enough to erase the harm she had caused. By the end of the meeting, the school announced that Miss Holloway would be placed on temporary leave pending an investigation. It wasn't the resolution Jasmine had hoped for, but it was a start. As she left the auditorium, She felt the weight of the stairs following her. Outside, her father placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "This isn't the end," he said, "but you've done something important today. You've made people see what they've been blind to for too long." Jasmine nodded, her heart heavy but her resolve unshaken. The fight was far from over, but she knew she wasn't alone anymore. Chapter 6. Into the Fire. The days following the town hall meeting were anything but calm for Jasmine. The school was abuzz with whispers about the suspension of Miss Holloway. For some students, it was a welcome decision that reinforced the importance of accountability, while others viewed it as an unnecessary upheaval. Jasmine, however, became the unwitting focal point of both admiration and resentment. Some classmates began to show quiet support, small gestures like an encouraging nod or a brief smile in the hallway. But these were overshadowed by the muttered comments and icy stares from others. Jasmine felt their judgment, the unspoken accusations hanging in the air. Why couldn't she have just let things be? In the classroom, the presence of a substitute teacher failed to dispel the heavy atmosphere. Miss Holloway's absence left a void, her influence lingering in the form of strained dynamics and unspoken tensions. Jasmine focused on her work, keeping her head down, but the weight of the classroom's collective scrutiny was inescapable. Every word she spoke during discussions, every contribution she made to group work, seemed to provoke a silent but palpable backlash. One particular project brought these tensions to a boil. Jasmine was grouped with three classmates, including Sarah, whose growing empathy was evident but hesitant, and two boys, Michael and Chris, who had been openly critical of Jasmine since the town hall. The group's task was to analyze a key passage from a novel and present their findings to the class. From the outset, the atmosphere within the group was hostile. Michael sat with his arms crossed, refusing to engage, while Chris scribbled notes independently, making no effort to collaborate. Jasmine, determined to contribute meaningfully, outlined her ideas with care, but her words were met with dismissive gestures and muttered sarcasm. As the deadline approached, the hostility became overt. Michael accused Jasmine of monopolizing the project, his tone laced with frustration, while Chris dismissed her points as overly complex and irrelevant. Sarah remained silent, her discomfort evident, but she offered no intervention. The lack of unity was glaring, and the substitute teacher's attempts to mediate only scratched the surface of the deeper issues at play. The culmination of these tensions came when the group presented their findings. Michael and Chris subtly undermined Jasmine, critiquing her ideas in front of the class under the guise of constructive feedback. Their words stung, their intent unmistakable. The substitute teacher, caught off guard, attempted to redirect the discussion, but failed to address the underlying hostility. Jasmine's silence in response spoke volumes, a quiet act of resistance against their attempts to diminish her. The experience left Jasmine emotionally drained. As she walked home that evening, the weight of the day pressed heavily on her. The judgment from her classmates, the ineffectiveness of the substitute, and the seemingly unshakable legacy of Miss Holloway's prejudice all swirled in her mind. At home, her father noticed her withdrawn demeanor, but refrained from pressing her for details. Jasmine retreated to her room, seeking solace in the familiarity of her books and notes. As she flipped through pages of her notebook, she found herself replaying the events in her mind, her frustration slowly transforming into resolve. The following day, Jasmine was called to the principal's office. The unexpected summons filled her with apprehension. Inside, she was met by the principal and Mr. Harris, the school counselor. They expressed concern about the group project and the escalating tensions in the classroom. Though their words were sympathetic, Jasmine sensed a reluctance to fully acknowledge the systemic nature of the problem. She calmly explained her perspective, emphasizing the need for fairness and respect, not pity. The meeting ended with promises of support, but Jasmine knew the road ahead would be far from easy. As she left the office, a new determination took root within her. Jasmine understood that change would not come without struggle. The hostility she faced was not just about one teacher or one classroom. It was a reflection of deeper issues within the school's culture. She resolved to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for every student who had ever felt silenced or dismissed. Jasmine stepped into the school building, her books held tightly against her chest, a shield of composure she had learned to wield. The usual hum of chatter in the hallways seemed muted, replaced by a strange stillness that unnerved her. As she walked past clusters of students, she felt the weight of their stares pressing into her back. When she reached her locker, her world seemed to tilt. Across the metal door, scrawled in jagged black letters, were the words, "Know your place, black girl." Her breath caught in her throat. The message wasn't just an insult. It was a weapon meant to cut her down where she stood. The boldness of it, the deliberate nature, was a new level of cruelty. She stared at the words, her body frozen, her mind racing. The hallway seemed to close in around her. Students slowed as they passed, their eyes darting between Jasmine and the graffiti. Some averted their gaze entirely while others lingered, their expressions a mix of shock, curiosity, and, in some cases, satisfaction. Jasmine's hands trembled as she reached for the lock, desperate to erase the scene before her, but a teacher's voice interrupted her. "Jasmine," the woman said gently, stepping closer. "Come with me. We'll handle this." Jasmine turned, her face carefully composed despite the storm inside her. She followed the teacher to the principal's office. The words on the locker etched into her mind like a brand. In the principal's office, Jasmine sat stiffly in a chair, her father beside her. His presence was a silent pillar of strength, but she could feel his anger simmering beneath the surface. Principal Carter leaned forward, his expression a mixture of concern and discomfort. "This is an unacceptable incident," he began, his voice heavy. "We're launching an immediate investigation to identify the perpetrator. Jasmine, I assure you, we take this very seriously." Jasmine said nothing. She had heard similar reassurances before, but they felt hollow now. Actions, not words, were what mattered. Her father broke the silence. "What measures are you putting in place to ensure my daughter's safety moving forward?" His tone was calm, but the steel in his voice was unmistakable. Principal Carter hesitated. "We'll increase monitoring in the hallways and implement additional diversity training for the staff," he offered. Jasmine finally spoke, her voice measured but unyielding. "This isn't about one incident," she said. "It's about the culture that allows things like this to happen. If you want to make a real difference, you have to address the root of the problem, not just the symptoms." Her words hung in the air, the weight of them undeniable. By the time lunch rolled around, the entire school knew about the graffiti. Jasmine walked into the cafeteria, her head held high, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Conversations hushed as she passed, eyes tracking her every move. She scanned the room, searching for a friendly face, but even Sarah, who had been a quiet ally in recent weeks, looked away. Jasmine turned and walked out of the cafeteria, her appetite gone. Outside, she found a bench under a tree and sat down, the cold air biting at her skin. She stared at the ground, her mind replaying the morning's events like a broken record. She didn't notice Sarah approaching until the girl spoke. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jasmine looked up, her expression unreadable. "I should have said something," Sarah continued. "When I saw the writing, I should have stood up for you." Jasmine's gaze softened, but her tone remained firm. "It's not about what you should have done," she said. "It's about what you do next." Sarah nodded, her face pale but resolute. The last class of the day was literature, and Jasmine braced herself as she walked into the room. The substitute teacher greeted her with a polite nod, but the tension in the classroom was palpable. The teacher announced a roundtable discussion on systemic injustice in literature, and Jasmine's stomach twisted. The topic was relevant, but in this environment, it felt like a trap. The discussion started cautiously, with students offering vague and non-committal opinions. But then Michael, one of Jasmine's most vocal detractors, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Don't you think people make too big of a deal about racism these days?" he said. "I mean, isn't it just as racist to assume everything is about race?" The comment sent a ripple through the room. Some students nodded, while others looked away uncomfortably. Jasmine felt her pulse quicken as she considered her response. Taking a deep breath, she spoke. "Racism isn't always loud," she said. "It's not just slurs or graffiti. It's the assumptions people make about you, the way those assumptions go unchallenged, and how silence becomes complicity." Her voice was steady, but the room's reaction was anything but. The substitute teacher shifted awkwardly, trying to steer the conversation back on track, but the divide in the room was clear. Jasmine felt the hostility from some classmates like a physical weight. When the bell rang, Jasmine gathered her things quickly, but as she reached the door, she heard Michael mutter to Chris, "She always has to make it about race. No wonder people can't stand her." The words hit like a punch to the gut, but Jasmine didn't look back. She walked out with her head held high, determined to face whatever came next. The following morning, Jasmine entered the school with a weight heavier than her backpack. Whispers followed her like shadows, curling around her as she made her way down the hall. The graffiti incident had set the tone, but now it was as though the very air of the school conspired to push her out. When she reached her locker, she found it spotless, freshly painted. The cruel words were gone, but the memory remained, raw and vivid. As she stood there, her hand hesitating on the handle, she noticed an envelope taped to the door. Her name was scrawled on it in uneven letters. Heart pounding, she pulled it down and unfolded the paper inside. The message was short but chilling. "You don't belong here. Leave before things get worse." Her breath hitched as she scanned the hallway. No one looked at her directly, but a few students smirked as though they knew exactly what she had found. Jasmine crumpled the note in her fist, her knuckles white with tension, and shoved it deep into her bag. The day passed in a haze of half-heard lessons and sidelong glances. Even the teachers seemed on edge, their attempts to maintain normalcy faltering under the weight of the unspoken. Jasmine kept her head down, but every word, every look, felt like a stone added to the mountain she carried. By lunchtime, she felt drained, her usual resolve battered. She sat alone in the cafeteria, her tray untouched. Across the room, Sarah met her eyes briefly but quickly looked away. Jasmine's stomach churned, not from the food but from the isolation that had settled around her like a cage. The final blow came during literature class. The substitute teacher had assigned a new essay. "What does justice mean to you?" The topic, under normal circumstances, would have stirred Jasmine's passion. But as the teacher handed out the assignment sheets, she overheard Michael and Chris muttering behind her. "Bet she'll turn it into another sob story about racism," Chris said, not even bothering to lower his voice. Michael laughed. "Of course she will. It's her whole personality." The words stung, sharper than the note or the stares. Jasmine clenched her fists under the desk, her nails digging into her palms. The teacher cleared her throat, pulling Jasmine out of her thoughts. "This essay is due next week," she said. "I want you all to think deeply and write honestly." Jasmine stared at the blank sheet in front of her. Her mind swirled with 1,000 thoughts, none of which she could put into words. She felt trapped, expected to speak up, yet punished every time she did. After class, as she gathered her things, the substitute teacher called her over. "Jasmine," she began, her tone soft but patronizing, "I hope you understand that the classroom is a place for balanced perspectives. It's important not to alienate others with overly personal interpretations." Jasmine blinked, her face carefully neutral. The hypocrisy of the statement burned, but she said nothing. Outside the classroom, the hallway was unusually quiet. As Jasmine turned the corner, she froze. Her essay assignment sheet was taped to the bulletin board, a large red X drawn across it in marker. Below it, someone had written, "Justice? People like you wouldn't know the meaning of the word." Jasmine's breath caught. The humiliation was complete, public, and undeniable. A few students lingered nearby, watching her reaction with morbid curiosity. She turned on her heel and walked away, her vision blurred with unshed tears. At home that evening, Jasmine sat at her desk, staring at her laptop screen. The blank document for the essay taunted her, the cursor blinking like a silent accusation. She wanted to write, to pour her anger and pain into words, but every attempt felt futile. Her father knocked softly on the door before stepping inside. "Jazz," he said, his voice gentle, "you've been quiet since you got home. Want to talk about it?" Jasmine shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. He sat down beside her, his presence warm and steady. "You're strong, Jasmine," he said, "but even the strongest people need support sometimes. Whatever's happening, you don't have to face it alone." His words broke something in her. The tears she had held back all day spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands. Her father wrapped an arm around her, letting her cry without interruption. When she finally found her voice, it was small and shaky. "They hate me," she whispered. "No matter what I do, it's never enough." Her father sighed, his own frustration evident. "Hate comes from ignorance," he said, "and ignorance thrives in silence. You can't let them win by letting them silence you." Jasmine nodded, though the weight of his words felt too heavy to carry just yet. That night, Jasmine lay awake, her mind replaying the day's events. The note, the comments, the essay on the board, they were all designed to break her. And for a moment, she wondered if they had succeeded. But as the hours passed, a new resolve began to form. They wanted her to feel small, to doubt her worth, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She sat up, turned on her laptop, and began to type. The essay flowed from her like a dam breaking, raw and unfiltered. She wrote about justice, not as an abstract ideal, but as something deeply personal and painfully absent. She wrote about the silent complicity of those who turned away, the cruelty of those who acted, and the courage it took to stand up in a world that wanted you to sit down. When she finished, the cursor stopped blinking. Jasmine stared at the screen, her heart pounding. It wasn't just an essay, it was a declaration, and it was only the beginning. Jasmine's walk to school the morning after her essay's rejection felt heavier than ever. The weight of the note, the dismissive attitude of the substitute teacher, and the unspoken judgment of her peers loomed over her. Every step echoed with the memories of the assembly planning meeting, where she had been ignored entirely despite being in the room, and the sting of Mr. Sterling's thinly veiled indifference. Inside the school, the atmosphere had shifted further. It wasn't just the usual whispers or occasional smirks. The silence now carried a palpable tension, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Jasmine could feel it in the sidelong glances from her classmates, the hurried avoidance of her presence, and the way even her few allies seemed to distance themselves. The graffiti on her locker had been scrubbed clean by the janitor, but the words remained etched in her mind. "Know your place." It wasn't just an insult, it was a warning. Jasmine knew what it meant. Don't try to stand out, don't make yourself heard, and don't challenge the status quo. The substitute teacher started the literature class with an air of practiced authority, her monotone voice guiding the students through a discussion of symbolism in the assigned text. Jasmine sat at her desk, her notebook open, but her pen idle. She wanted to speak up, to offer her perspective, but the energy to fight felt drained from her. The teacher's red ink critique was still fresh in her mind, and she doubted her words would carry any weight in this room. "Let's hear from someone who hasn't spoken much," the teacher said, scanning the room. Her gaze settled on Jasmine, and for a moment, Jasmine thought she might finally be acknowledged. But the teacher's eyes slid past her, settling instead on a student in the back row. Jasmine's stomach churned. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but today it felt deliberate, as if her presence was being systematically erased. During lunch, Jasmine found her usual spot in the library taken. She wandered the hallways, her steps aimless until she ended up in the courtyard. A group of students was gathered near the fountain, their laughter sharp and mocking. She recognized one of the boys from her literature class, someone who had joined in the whispered jokes during the previous day's discussion. As she approached, she caught snippets of their conversation. "Always playing the victim," one of them said, loud enough for her to hear. "Maybe if she spent less time complaining and more time fitting in, things would be different." The group laughed, their voices blending into a chorus of cruelty. Jasmine's fists clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to confront them, to demand why they found her pain so amusing, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding. She could feel their laughter following her, chasing her down the hallway. By the time she reached the bathroom, Jasmine could barely hold back the tears. She locked herself in a stall, her breathing ragged as she tried to regain control. She thought of her essay, the hours she had spent crafting each word, and how it had been reduced to a critique of her focus. She thought of her father's words, his encouragement to stand tall against adversity. But right now, it felt impossible. The walls of the stall seemed to close in around her, the weight of it all threatening to crush her. For the first time, Jasmine wondered if it was worth it. If speaking up, trying to make a difference, was worth the constant humiliation and isolation. The final blow came during the school-wide assembly planning session. Jasmine had been reluctant to attend, but her father's gentle reminder about the importance of representation had persuaded her. When she arrived, the room was already buzzing with activity. Teachers and students were gathered around tables, discussing themes and ideas for the event. Jasmine found a seat at the edge of the room, hoping to contribute. But as the discussion unfolded, it became clear she wasn't welcome. Every suggestion she made was met with polite nods, but no follow-through. At one point, a teacher interrupted her mid-sentence to move on to someone else. By the end of the meeting, Jasmine felt invisible. As the others filed out, chatting animatedly about their plans, Jasmine sat alone, staring at her notebook. She had come here hoping to be part of a change, to make a difference. But all she had found was more of the same: indifference, dismissal, and a quiet, pervasive resistance to her presence. That evening, Jasmine sat in her room, staring at the essay on her desk. She thought of the words she had written, the truths she had tried to share. She thought of the laughter in the courtyard, the silence in the classroom, and the dismissal in the planning session. Her father knocked gently on the door before stepping inside. He didn't say anything, just sat down beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. Jasmine didn't look at him. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was soft but firm. "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones worth fighting, but only you can decide if this is one of them." Jasmine nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. She wasn't sure if she believed them, but they gave her a sliver of hope to hold on to. As the night stretched on, Jasmine sat alone in her room, the essay still in front of her. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing: she couldn't let this be the end of her story. The morning air was heavy with unspoken tension as Jasmine walked into the school. The whispers that trailed her had grown louder, their edges sharper, and her steps felt heavier with every passing glance that lingered too long. Today was different. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a quiet storm brewing, one that seemed poised to break over her. Jasmine made her way to her locker, her fingers fumbling with the combination as her thoughts swirled. When the door swung open, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the ground. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up. Her heart sank as she unfolded the note. "You don't belong here." She clenched the paper in her fist, her pulse pounding in her ears. Jasmine had faced countless small aggressions, but this felt different, bolder, more direct. The note wasn't just a message, it was a warning. In the classroom, the tension was palpable. The substitute teacher, Ms. Carter, stood at the front of the room, her demeanor as icy as ever. Today, she announced, the class would be working on group projects to prepare presentations for the upcoming assembly. The groups were pre-assigned, and Jasmine found herself paired with two students who had avoided her at every opportunity. The table felt colder than the rest of the room as they gathered their materials in silence. Jasmine tried to contribute, offering ideas for their project, but her voice was met with indifference. One of her group members, a boy named Dylan, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "You've got all the answers, don't you?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Jasmine didn't respond, her fingers tightening around her pen. At lunch, Jasmine found herself alone again. The whispers and sidelong glances followed her to the courtyard, where she sat under a tree with her notebook. She tried to lose herself in her writing, but the words refused to come. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones worth fighting." But today, those words felt more like a burden than a beacon. How could she fight when every step forward was met with resistance, every effort to belong met with rejection? The breaking point came during the assembly planning meeting after lunch. Jasmine had prepared a list of ideas, determined to contribute despite the morning's challenges. But as the meeting began, it became clear she was fighting a losing battle. Her suggestions were ignored, her voice drowned out by louder, more confident ones. When she finally managed to speak up, Ms. Carter dismissed her idea with a wave of her hand. "We're looking for something more inclusive," the teacher said, her tone laced with irony. Jasmine's chest tightened, her face burning with frustration and humiliation. She wanted to shout, to demand why her voice was always deemed less worthy, but the weight of the room pressed down on her. By the end of the day, Jasmine's resolve had crumbled. She sat on the steps outside the school, her notebook open in her lap but untouched. The note from her locker played on a loop in her mind, its message echoing louder with every passing second. For a moment, she considered giving up, walking away from the school, the assembly, and the constant uphill battle. But deep down, a spark of defiance refused to be snuffed out. Her father's words came back to her, stronger this time. The hardest battles are the ones worth fighting. Jasmine closed her notebook, her grip firm and steady. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she couldn't let this be the end. Not yet. The group laughed, their voices blending into a chorus of cruelty. Jasmine's fists clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to confront them, to demand why they found her pains so amusing, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding. She could feel their laughter following her, chasing her down the hallway. By the time she reached the bathroom, Jasmine could barely hold back the tears. She locked herself in a stall, her breathing ragged as she tried to regain control. She thought of her essay, the hours she had spent crafting each word, and how it had been reduced to a critique of her focus. She thought of her father's words, his encouragement to stand tall against adversity. But right now it felt impossible. The walls of the stall seemed to close in around her, the weight of it all threatening to crush her. For the first time, Jasmine wondered if it was worth it. If speaking up, trying to make a difference, was worth the constant humiliation and isolation. The final blow came during the school-wide assembly planning session. Jasmine had been reluctant to attend, but her father's gentle reminder about the importance of representation had persuaded her. When she arrived, the room was already buzzing with activity. Teachers and students were gathered around tables, discussing themes and ideas for the event. Jasmine found a seat at the edge of the room, hoping to contribute. But as the discussion unfolded, it became clear she wasn't welcome. Every suggestion she made was met with polite nods, but no follow-through. At one point, a teacher interrupted her mid-sentence to move on to someone else. By the end of the meeting, Jasmine felt invisible. As the others filed out, chatting animatedly about their plans, Jasmine sat alone, staring at her notebook. She had come here hoping to be part of a change, to make a difference. But all she had found was more of the same: indifference, dismissal, and a quiet, pervasive resistance to her presence. That evening, Jasmine sat in her room, staring at the essay on her desk. She thought of the words she had written, the truth she had tried to share. She thought of the laughter in the courtyard, the silence in the classroom, and the dismissal in the planning session. Her father knocked gently on the door before stepping inside. He didn't say anything, just sat down beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. Jasmine didn't look at him. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was soft but firm. "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones worth fighting, but only you can decide if this is one of them." Jasmine nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. She wasn't sure if she believed them, but they gave her a sliver of hope to hold on to. As the night stretched on, Jasmine sat alone in her room, the essay still in front of her. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing: she couldn't let this be the end of her story. The morning air was heavy with unspoken tension as Jasmine walked into the school. The whispers that trailed her had grown louder, their edges sharper, and her steps felt heavier with every passing glance that lingered too long. Today was different. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a quiet storm brewing, one that seemed poised to break over her. Jasmine made her way to her locker, her fingers fumbling with the combination as her thoughts swirled. When the door swung open, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the ground. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up. Her heart sank as she unfolded the note. "You don't belong here." She clenched the paper in her fist, her pulse pounding in her ears. Jasmine had faced countless small aggressions, but this felt different, bolder, more direct. The note wasn't just a message, it was a warning. In the classroom, the tension was palpable. The substitute teacher, Ms. Carter, stood at the front of the room, her demeanor as icy as ever. "Today," she announced, The class would be working on group projects to prepare presentations for the upcoming assembly. The groups were pre-assigned, and Jasmine found herself paired with two students who had avoided her at every opportunity. The table felt colder than the rest of the room as they gathered their materials in silence. Jasmine tried to contribute, offering ideas for their project, but her voice was met with indifference. One of her group members, a boy named Dylan, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "You've got all the answers, don't you?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Jasmine didn't respond, her fingers tightening around her pen. At lunch, Jasmine found herself alone again. The whispers and sidelong glances followed her to the courtyard, where she sat under a tree with her notebook. She tried to lose herself in her writing, but the words refused to come. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones worth fighting. But today those words felt more like a burden than a beacon. How could she fight when every step forward was met with resistance? Every effort to belong met with rejection. The breaking point came during the assembly planning meeting after lunch. Jasmine had prepared a list of ideas, determined to contribute despite the morning's challenges. But as the meeting began, it became clear she was fighting a losing battle. Her suggestions were ignored, her voice drowned out by louder, more confident ones. When she finally managed to speak up, Ms. Carter dismissed her idea with a wave of her hand. "We're looking for something more inclusive," the teacher said, her tone laced with irony. Jasmine's chest tightened, her face burning with frustration and humiliation. She wanted to shout, to demand why her voice was always deemed less worthy, but the weight of the room pressed down on her. By the end of the day, Jasmine's resolve had crumbled. She sat on the steps outside the school, her notebook open in her lap but untouched. The note from her locker played on a loop in her mind, its message echoing louder with every passing second. For a moment, she considered giving up, walking away from the school, the assembly, and the constant uphill battle. But deep down, a spark of defiance refused to be snuffed out. Her father's words came back to her, stronger this time. The hardest battles are the ones worth fighting. Jasmine closed her notebook, her grip firm and steady. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she couldn't let this be the end. Not yet. The final week of the school term arrived, bringing with it the weight of unresolved tensions. Jasmine had become the unspoken center of a storm brewing in the school. Her story was whispered about in every hallway, her resilience admired by some, but mocked by others. The administration, under increasing scrutiny from the principal, Mr. Whitaker, and the broader community, had arranged an all-school assembly to address the growing concerns about bias and discrimination. Jasmine sat near the back of the auditorium, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what to expect, but the hollow promises she'd overheard in passing conversations among faculty members had left her cynical. For weeks, she had endured every subtle jab, every outright act of dismissal, and the constant erosion of her spirit. Today, however, felt different. Today felt like a moment when everything could finally shift, or completely collapse. The assembly began predictably. Administrators spoke in vague terms about fostering unity, respecting diversity, and ensuring a safe space for all students. Jasmine's classmates were restless, shifting in their seats and murmuring to one another. She could feel the disinterest radiating through the room as hollow platitudes were delivered with little conviction. Then Mr. Whitaker stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. His voice carried authority, but it was the intensity in his eyes that silenced the room. "Injustice isn't always loud," he began, his voice steady. "Sometimes it whispers in classrooms, lingers in hallways, and hides behind polite smiles. But its impact is no less damaging. Today we confront a reality many of us have ignored for too long." A murmur swept through the crowd. Jasmine's pulse quickened. Mr. Whitaker continued, his gaze sweeping over the students. "Over the past weeks, this school has failed one of its own. We have allowed prejudice to fester, unchecked and unchallenged. Today we acknowledge those failures, and we commit to change." He turned toward the side of the stage, where a microphone stood waiting. "Jasmine King, would you join us, please?" The room stilled as every head turned to Jasmine. Her heart leapt into her throat, but she rose, her steps steady, despite the tremor in her hands. As she walked toward the stage, a ripple of applause began, tentative at first, but growing louder with each step. Standing at the podium, Jasmine gripped the edges to steady herself. The spotlight illuminated her, but she felt oddly calm. This was her moment, not just to defend herself, but to demand better for everyone who had endured what she had. She began with a deep breath, her voice low but unwavering. When I first came to this school, I believed that hard work and kindness would be enough to earn respect. But I was wrong. From the moment I walked into that classroom, I was met with prejudice. Quiet, persistent, and relentless. I was ignored, dismissed, and mocked because of the color of my skin. And I know I'm not the only one. The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over the audience. Jasmine's gaze swept over her peers. Racism doesn't always look like a slur or a shout. Sometimes it's a teacher who refuses to call on you. Sometimes it's a note on your locker or a whisper behind your back. And sometimes it's the silence of those who see it happening and say nothing. Her voice broke slightly, but she pressed on. I'm standing here today not just for myself, but for everyone who's been told they don't belong. For everyone who's had to fight twice as hard to be seen as equal. And I'm asking you to choose differently, to speak up, to stand up, and to make this school and this world a place where every voice matters. The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't the polite, scattered clapping of before. It was thunderous, heartfelt, and unifying. Jasmine's classmates stood, their cheers echoing through the auditorium. She saw faces she didn't expect, students who had ignored her, even mocked her, now standing in solidarity. As the applause subsided, Mr. Whitaker returned to the podium, his expression resolute. Thank you, Jasmine. Your courage is a reminder of the work we have ahead. As a school, we are committing to real change. Diversity workshops will begin next term, and we are forming a student-led committee to ensure every voice is heard. Jasmine, we'd like you to lead it. In the weeks that followed, Jasmine's life changed in ways she couldn't have imagined. The student committee became a platform for open dialogue and accountability. Stories poured out. Others who had felt silenced or overlooked found the courage to speak up. The school's culture began to shift, slowly but undeniably. For Jasmine, the scars of those early weeks remained, but they became a testament to her strength. She hadn't just survived, she had transformed pain into power, silence into change. Her story spread beyond the school, inspiring others to confront their own biases and fight for justice in their communities. And as she walked the halls, she no longer felt like an outsider. She had carved out a place not just for herself, but for everyone who dared to believe in a better future. Her journey was far from over, but as she passed the mural now painted on the school wall, a soaring phoenix with the words "Rise Together," Jasmine smiled. Change was possible, and she had proved it. The days after the hearing were quieter, but they carried a different weight. Jasmine walked through the school halls, her steps steady and purposeful. Faces turned her way, not with disdain or judgment anymore, but with recognition. The mural in the main corridor was nearly finished, a project spearheaded by students to represent unity and hope. Jasmine had declined the offer to paint her likeness in the center. Instead, she suggested a simple image, interlocked hands of different colors, holding each other firmly. One morning, as Jasmine organized her books at her locker, a familiar voice called her name. It was Sarah, the classmate who had initially stayed silent, but had eventually become one of Jasmine's strongest allies. Jasmine, can I show you something? Sarah asked, holding out her phone. On the screen was an email, an invitation to Jasmine to speak at a regional conference about combating racism in education. Jasmine's breath caught. She had thought her story would end with the changes at Westbrook, but this invitation meant her voice could reach beyond these walls. As the news spread, some students approached her with encouragement, while others were more hesitant, their expressions a mix of respect and uncertainty. Change was not instant, it was incremental, and Jasmine had learned to be patient. On the day of the conference, Jasmine stood backstage, her hands gripping the edges of her note cards. The weight of everything, the past months, the trial, the ongoing work, pressed on her. But then she looked out at the audience. Teachers, students, parents, people from every walk of life had come to listen. She stepped up to the podium, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Change is difficult, but necessary. It starts when we face uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the systems we live in, she began. It's not just about what's wrong, but about imagining what can be right. I didn't want to stand here today as a victim. I'm standing here as a reminder that one voice can create ripples. As she finished, the applause was loud but not overwhelming. It felt purposeful, as if those claps carried the weight of acknowledgement rather than empty praise. Later that evening, as Jasmine returned home, she found her father waiting for her on the porch. He didn't say much, just handed her a letter. It was from a younger student at Westbrook, someone she barely knew. The letter read, "Because of you, I don't feel invisible anymore. Thank you for helping us see each other." Jasmine folded the letter and slipped it into her journal, where she kept the memories that mattered most. The fight wasn't over, but she didn't need it to be. Change wasn't about winning a single battle. It was about continuing to push forward one step at a time. And with every step, Jasmine knew her story would echo in places she had yet to see. Jasmine's story shows that one voice can spark change for an entire community. Have you ever faced injustice or witnessed someone being overlooked? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice could inspire someone else. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video to spread the powerful message of justice and equality. Change starts with us.